So without further ado, let's get started with our first talk on the psychodynamics of social networking from Dr. Aaron Balick. So Aaron is a psychotherapist, cultural theorist, and author, applying ideas from depth psychology to culture and technology. He's an Honorary Senior Lecturer at the Department for Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. As a psychological consultant for the media, he's advised and contributed to a variety of projects that aim to bring quality mental health content to programming for young people and adults alike. Aaron has been an agony uncle for many years for both CBBC and BBC Radio 1, online, on the radio, and on the television. His books include The Psychodynamics of Social Networking, Connected Up, Instantaneous, Culture and the Self, which he'll speak on today, the illustrated children's self-help book, Keep Your Cool, How to Deal with Life's Worries and Stress, and most recently, the Little Book of Calm, Tame Your Anxieties, Face Your Fears, and Live Free. Aaron is the director of Still Point Spaces, an international psychology, co-working, therapy, and events hub in London, which I have been a member of and can highly recommend. You can learn more about Aaron's work on his website, www.aaronbalick.com, and more about Still Point Spaces at www.stillpointspaces.com. So, Aaron, it's a pleasure to have you with us here today. I'm really excited about this. Whenever you're ready, let's just get started. Okay.
Great. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Niall. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm sharing my first slide with you, and I just want to reflect for a second as I do how this sort of COVID situation mimics, because of our reliance on technology, it kind of mimics a lot about what I'm going to be talking about today. So, for example, I can't see any of you, but you can see me. And I know that I'm talking to several of you. I don't know how many. And at the same time, I'm sitting in my room, in my office by myself. So it feels like I'm talking to myself. And a lot of you will be familiar with this when we talk about social media. It mimics the same dynamic, which is going to be really important. So that dynamic primarily being when you're engaging with social media, most of the time, you're having a relationship kind of seemingly on the surface with yourself, because you're generally the only one there, while at the same time communicating to a larger community, either sort of a limited one via Facebook or perhaps a nearly unlimited one on something like Twitter if you have a public profile. So this paradox of being alone together, to use Sherry Turkle's words, is something I'm going to be reflecting on. And just so you know what to expect a little bit, we're going to do this first 45 minutes. I'm going to be talking mainly about the findings in my book from the interpersonal subjective perspective, so what happens to the individual. And then I'm going to move on in the second half to talk about the more sociocultural stuff that's going on in relation to social media, which I kind of went on to research more past the book. The book focuses mostly on the individual's relationship to social media, but then I kind of realized, the book was published in 2014, that maybe we need to be thinking about the sociocultural as well. So many of you will be familiar with this guy, and if you recognize this picture, it was when he was speaking to Congress in the USA about last year. And anybody who saw any of those hearings will kind of get a sense of what we should kind of be worried about. Basically, Mark Zuckerberg was running rings around the members of Congress who hardly understood the functioning of Facebook just as a user, let alone the background algorithms and how it works. And we now live in a situation where actually very few people have comprehensive understanding of how social networks operate, much more than international and national governments, which kind of produces some pretty serious questions about regulation and how these things ought to be monitored. So we really need to understand it, I think, from a psychological perspective. And the more we understand it from a psychological perspective, the more we can engage in regulation and how it's developed forward. And as we'll see in the second half of today's lecture, really, really important, crucial moments here, particularly in relation to how social media can affect things like elections. Before we get into that, I'm going to talk with you about the personal. So everybody who has a social media profile should be able to relate to this in some way. And what I'm going to be doing is applying psychodynamic theory to the way in which we use different kinds of social media so that we can understand it more from a psychological perspective. But before we start, I want to do a little interactive exercise with you. This one tends to work better in real life than it does online because you are kind of beside the people that you're going to be sharing the last book you read with. But what I do in a live session is I take this beach ball, I blow it up, and I throw it out into the audience, and I ask whoever randomly catches the ball the first time just to say out loud what book it is that they're reading at the moment, or the last book they remember reading. And that's all they have to do. Catch the ball, say the book that they're reading, and then toss the ball randomly into the audience where somebody else does the same thing. So I'm going to toss an imaginary ball out there into the virtual world because those are our current limitations. And if you just in the chat bar, maybe let me know the book that you're reading at the moment. And actually, I have a look at the chat bar here so I can read some of them out. Let's see, I see Grassroots Spirituality, 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now. That one's, wow, they're coming quick and fast now. City of Ashes, Wolf Hall, Invisible Women, Camus, The Outsider, Myth of Sisyphus, another Camus. I'm sure you're all looking at your chat lines too. So The Shining, oh wow, that's a good one. Sapiens, How We Get Free, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, Lost Connections, Wild, Why We Sleep, Learning to Counsel. Let's see if I find, and Getting Our Bodies Back. Okay. Oh, The Body Remembers is another good one there. Now, it is, again, hard to replicate the real world situation in an online situation. But what I usually do next is I ask people how they feel when that ball is coming at them, right? So in this situation, you're voluntarily putting something in a chat. There's a little bit of distance. Nobody's seeing your face. You're not saying the title of the book out to the entire room. When we're in a room together, you don't know whether you're going to get the ball. You receive the ball, and then you're put on the spot to say something out loud. And the lesson in this, in a sense, is what is the thing that happens to you in that moment of expectation when I ask the question and you've got to answer it in front of your peers? And what we often get is a lot of anxiety. And we get a lot of anxiety depending on kind of what group is in the room. Sometimes these are groups where people are with their, if it's a counseling training, for example, they're with their trainers, their tutors, maybe their supervisor. Someone in the chat just said, my mind goes blank. Sometimes it's just in a general conference, say on technology, or a general conference on psychology, or one like this, where we're looking at both, and people get nervous. And the question is, why do people get nervous, right? And that's what we're going to be talking about. Someone just said, oh shit. Yeah. Okay. Isn't it interesting, though, that the oh shit moment arises when I'm asking what you could say is a relatively banal question. What's the last book you read, right? What's the big deal? It's just a book, right? But we know the answer to that question because we know that you're not posting just the last book you've read, that you are making an identity statement, right? So it is one thing if you say, I'm reading Camus or Kafka, and it is another thing if you're reading 50 Shades of Grey, right? Now, you may be reading one or the other, but who you represent yourself as to the world by way of the title of the book is about your identity and how you want to show up in front of people. So I imagine this is a smart enough crowd, so you kind of know, where I'm going with this, right? So some of you may or may not be familiar with this expression. Anybody want to pop that one into the chat bar if you know what this means? Give you 5 seconds. Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Miriam. What you see is what you get. This is kind of the idea, right? What you see is what you get. This is the book title I'm putting out there. This is the book I'm reading. But actually, when you think about it, what you get is not what you see. Okay, so we see the book title, we see Camus, for example, but we don't see the process, the emotional, psychological process that's going on in somebody's mind when they choose to say Camus out loud. We don't know that they're reading Camus. It could be 50 Shades of Grey, or it could be Camus. So we're going to start thinking about the process side of things, because what you see is not really what you get. What you get is more than what you see. So if anybody out there is familiar with Freud's theory on dreams, it kind of comes in handy about now. So Freud said that when you're analyzing a dream, you have to make a distinction between what you call the manifest content and the latent content. You're going to be asking me, what does Freud's interpretation of dreams have to do with social media? And I will get there, right? So the manifest content of a dream is what you dreamed, right? It's the images, the smells, the action, the stuff that you remember. It's the television show of your dream. That's manifest content. The latent content is the meaning of that dream. So, this manifest content is a symbolic representation of what's going on in your unconscious, that part of your unconscious makes into the dream to express the latent part that for Freud were parts of yourself that you didn't quite want to reveal to yourself. But what we know is that when we look closely into these things, manifest content is actually just a small part of what's going on in the dream. Most of it is latent. Most of it is meaning. And when we look at current methodologies for research at the moment, particularly qualitative research, we also understand the same thing about content and process, that in a sense, you can replace content and process with manifest and latent. Content is the stuff that you see. It's the words. So if you're doing research on Twitter, for example, you're looking at those tweets. The process is how you felt when I asked you to share the title of that dream. And just like manifest and latent, content and process is like 80%, maybe 95% of what's going on, and content is just a small bit. Yet most of the research that we do into things like social media, and actually any qualitative approach, just looks at content. So we're missing a lot. So if you think about that exercise very briefly, I could go up and down the country asking groups of people what book it is they're reading and produce a research report that says people in this demographic are reading these books. But we wouldn't get any of the process. So those questions like, are they reading these books? How do they feel about the fact that they're reading these books? Why are they anxious that they're naming this book in front of their peers? All of the good stuff basically is process, and process is what we're going to be talking about today. So let me just frame it for you very briefly. We tend to get into this state of mind that kind of states that, technology is something essentially different from what we're used to, but actually technology is just another kind of a tool. So humans distinguish themselves from most animals, except the higher primates, by their use of tools. And tools are there to extend ourselves into our environment better, right? And then we devise tools to interface with our environment. So for example, if we need to hammer a nail into a piece of wood, we can do that with a rock, but we can do it better with a hammer because we get leverage. So we develop tools from rock to hammer to enable us to engage with our external environment better. But the thing about tools is that they're not necessarily neutral, right? That they interact with our environments in the way we choose to interact. So a hammer can be a really brilliant tool to hammer a nail into a piece of wood. It can also be an excellent tool to knock somebody in the head with and kill them, right? So you can use a tool for another purpose. You can also try to screw a screw into a piece of wood with a hammer, and you won't do a very good job. So tools can be used for what they're intended for. They can be used for what they're not intended for well, or they can be used for what they're not intended for badly. Okay. So I want us to be thinking about our engagement with technology as a very highly sophisticated tool that can be used well or badly. It could be used for certain purposes and for other purposes that it's not so good at. So if we kind of just model this out, and you'll see I like these models, using quite a few of them. Imagine a self that is mediating between its unconscious, so what's going on in its psyche. You could include conscious awareness as well, and unconsciousness, and the environment. And basically what the unconscious does is it functions with the self to get its needs met in some kind of ways with the environment. You can read unconscious in a variety of different ways. If you want to take it from a strict Darwinian perspective, then you think the unconscious is a drive that produces thirst. The self experiences that thirst, and it goes into the environment to look for water. So that's a very basic way in which this would function. If you want to get a more complicated situation, and you take an attachment theory, for example, you could say that the unconscious desires love, and then it needs to go find love out in the environment, which is a bit more complicated task, as most people will probably agree, than it is to find a glass of water. So we develop tools to extend the reach of our needs and desires out into the environment. And if we kind of go back in time, we can look at sort of a primate man who wants to get some food, clothes, and tools that he can make out of this deer. And what does primate man do? He makes a tool, right? I've been told by many anthropologists that this is a terrible slide because Neanderthals did not make bows and arrows, but I think you probably get the idea. You imagine a spear instead. So we can see a leap in how we engage with our environments between running after a deer, throwing rocks, for example, and getting a bow and arrow or a spear and hunting a deer properly, right? So the tool enhances our ability to get what we need. But if we fast forward to modern times, we realize that our tools might make things too easy. So we take a modern person and we replace the tool with what? Any guesses today in modern Britain about what you replace the bow and arrow with to get what you need? Okay, someone said a gun. I think maybe more in the United States more than in the UK, but sometimes. So the gun would be the direct relationship. I think somebody got it right on the money though, Olivia. Yeah, money, right? So money becomes this universal tool. So yes, you can go out and shoot yourself a deer if you want to. There are not a whole lot of people doing that, but some are. But all the rest of us get money, and then we can buy what with that. We don't go for the deer anymore. We just kind of go for the burger, which we can get for very little money. And again, if we model this one out, what do we learn? Okay, that actually it takes a lot of energy and ingenuity to get that deer, even if you're using a bow and arrow. It doesn't take a whole lot of money or ingenuity to get that burger, especially these days when everything's on a Deliveroo. So the consequence is that our instinct drives us to get fat, protein, and carbohydrate, salt and sugar in certain quantities, but kind of has expected us to work for it. We don't need to work for it these days. And the consequence is generally a less healthy population because the instincts haven't changed, but the tools have enabled us to get us what we think we need more easily in proportions that aren't so helpful for us. So I'm sure you can see that this is a metaphor for social media that we're going to be talking about. We think about hierarchies of needs. This is a internet meme that I quite enjoy. You know, we think we need food, water, shelter, warmth first. But when you lose your Wi-Fi, you feel like you're in big trouble. And the question is why? You know, why does the loss of Wi-Fi suddenly create all of this anxiety? When you know there was no Wi-Fi 20 years ago, right? So something really crucial has changed. So let's think about this kind of widely and why this is all happening. And a lot of this has to do with the extension of ourselves through these tools that are technology and social media. So technology enables the extension of the self into the digital world, which is a real world, even if it's virtual. And psychology is the paradigm through which we can understand these extensions, because though we're extending ourselves through technology to get burgers with Deliveroo or Uber Eats, for example, we're also extending our psychology to get in relationship with other people, particularly over social media. The motivation for all of these extensions is derived from the unconscious, and it's played out through our consciousness, the choices that we make when we go online. And online interaction is a dance between the platform and the psychic agency. And that sounds a little bit confusing, so I'll explain it a little more. The platform would be whatever thing, app you're using online to get your needs met. And the psychic agency is that piece of your mind that you're engaged with in order to do so. So, for example, the platform could be Amazon, and the psychic agency could be ego, and the drive would be learning. So you log on to Amazon to get the books that you need to feed the learning part of your ego, in a sense. I don't mean ego in a pejorative way, just that part of you that's an I, which will be factoring in your interests. If the online platform is pornography, for example, the psychic agency could be id, and the motivation is sexuality, libido, right? So we can't make any large overarching statements or conclusions about technology doing something to psychology. We have to say what part of technology and what part of psychology. So if there's anything that drives me nuts, it's when people say the internet is doing this to people, right? For me, that's like saying the external environment is doing this to people, whether it's a workplace or whether it's your home, right? So it depends where you are and what your needs are in order to engage. So also really important, our active online identities are both intrapsychic and interpersonal. And what that means is an active online identity, rather than a passive one, is the choices that we make when we go online. So when you go onto Twitter and you tweet, you go onto Facebook and you post, or you just go on to look, you go into Instagram, you're being active. Your passive online identity is what happens when you Google yourself. There's not a lot you can do about that. You plug your name in, and this identity is produced on your behalf by Google. When we're making choices online, those choices are intrapsychic, which means all those different parts of your psychology at work to make choices, conscious and unconscious, about what goes on there, and interpersonal. So it's coming out from what's going on inside yourself, but also your expectations about what's going on between people. So it's really important always to think that both of these things are going on. Right now, I feel like I'm in a room talking to myself, but I know I'm talking to all of you, right? So it's intrapsychic, I'm having this experience with myself, and interpersonal, I'm having this experience with you. So again, let's model this out, right? So we have our unconscious, and we all have an unconscious. And if you are from a Jungian persuasion, you'll also believe that we also share aspects of unconsciousness, and we're all in relationship with each other. So you imagine each of these blue balls as being one self and another self in relationship with each other, being informed and led by unconscious desires, fantasies, motivations, etc. And what technology does, like this tool, is it sits on top of that relationship and it mediates it, right? So when you're relating to another self through Facebook, it goes through technology. It doesn't mean that this big blue arrow stops happening. People are still interrelating with each other all the time, and they're interrelating through technology. And it gets more and more complex. So you might be interrelating with the same person in real life and technology, or you might be interrelating with a person in real life and other people that you don't know just through technology. So it works in a whole variety of different ways, but almost always interpersonal and intrapsychic. So if you want a tweetable from this lecture, this one would be it, right? Psychologically, we discover ourselves between ourselves and others. Okay, for those of you who are familiar with Winnicott, you'll know that there's no such thing as a baby. And what he meant by that is that the baby needs its primary caregiver to understand who he or she is, right? We're not going to go too deeply into developmental psychology, but developmental psychology is really, really important for our purposes here, because we come from a place where our egos develop in relationship to others. And actually what we do across social media, or what we try to do through this tool, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work, is we try to discover ourselves between ourselves and others. That's why we do it. That's the thesis that I'm going to be sharing with you today. That's the main motivation. I want to discover myself. I want to discover you. And social media is the way I'm able to do that. So when we look at something like relational psychoanalysis, which is what I use to understand social media, one of the key ideas in that is recognition. And recognition is a very simple word, and that's why I like it. It's not full of jargon. And the idea is, and you can see very well in this picture, when there is a baby that is experiencing its unformed ego, its undifferentiated visceral experience, the job of the primary caretaker, which is so often the mother, is to recognize what's going on for that baby. And as the baby develops, that recognition turns into recognition of the ego, who that baby is, what the baby's personality will develop as. And the baby starts to do the same thing with its mother or primary caretaker, starts to recognize when mom is anxious, recognize when mom is okay and starts to alter their behavior in relation to the mother. Really, really important stuff. Now, Jessica Benjamin, who's one of the great theorists in relational psychoanalysis, says this. She says, recognition is to recognize, is to affirm, validate, acknowledge, know, accept, understand, empathize, take in, tolerate, appreciate, see, identify with, find familiar, and love. So there are a lot of verbs going on here, but just as an example for you to think about how important recognition is, all you have to do is think of one important moment in your life, probably from your childhood, and choose one of these words. Let's just take appreciate because it's an easy one. Think about a time when you required appreciation from someone, say a parent, and you didn't get it and how that felt. You know, like you brought home an art project from school and you wanted your mother or father to see it and like it, and they didn't get it. Or imagine a time when you wanted appreciation and you did get it, right? This desire to be recognized as a real human being is absolutely fundamental to our functioning. And it's a motivation that we experience every single day. And it's a motivation that, in a sense, we require or ask for when we go onto social media. And you think about the complexity that I'm getting at in this slide here, and you imagine going onto Facebook and getting it through something like this. Okay, so we may be sharing something across social media, and that like or that follow or that retweet or whatever you want to call it is actually doing the job of an unconscious desire to be recognized, to be affirmed, validated, acknowledged, or even loved. So it's really important to conceptualize here with me the complex nature of that desire and the simplicity of how it's met with online social media. Now, it used to be that you could just like, but I think, I don't remember, 2 or 3 years ago, Facebook at least introduced a few more options, right? So you could like or be angry or say wow or laugh or love, which gave a little bit more detail to the functioning. But still, we're talking about, six options here. Now, of course, we can make it more complex. We can add text. We could throw up a little GIF of something funny or video. We could share some music. So there is an introduction of more complexity in meeting the recognition need, but it is still functioning across the social network. So if we go and kind of map this out again, we see our old model here, the unconscious, two selves interrelating with each other. And then instead of technology, we choose which technology, because as I've been saying, the architecture of the technology is so very, very important as to what gets mediated and how. So you imagine two people in relationship with each other over technology, mediated by Facebook. And what does Facebook do? It speaks to the ego. So what is the ego? The ego is that part of yourself that mediates between your internal world and your external world. It synthesizes all of your unconscious stuff and produces it in a way that you relate to the world as an I, as a subject. And the reason why Facebook talks mostly, not exclusively, but mostly to ego, and again, I don't mean this pejoratively, I mean the ego as the I, although it can have pejorative effects, is because Facebook is kind of like a virtual public space. Now, what happens with the ego is it behaves in different ways depending on which public spaces you're in. So if you're in a fancy dinner party, your ego is going to behave differently than if it's 2 o'clock in a nightclub and you're completely inebriated. So the ego will pitch and turn depending on what its requirements are. And depending on who you're talking to on Facebook, your ego will do the same. And for most people, Facebook has a whole variety of different audiences, from family to friends to work colleagues, which in a sense has a consequence of reducing ego expression down to its lowest common denominator. You know, you don't want to offend some people that might, you don't want to appear one way to one group and the other group. So if everybody's in one place, your ego is going to be relatively conservative depending on who you are and who your Facebook following is and your settings. So for example, if your Facebook audience is just close friends, your ego will feel a little bit more free to engage than if it's a variety of different people. So I'm throwing this up just so you can see that this is a model for Facebook and it will be different for different social media. Now, if we take the one person side of what's going on Facebook, same model, you've got your unconscious communicating through the self, communicating through Facebook. Facebook kind of activating the ego, so that part of psyche that is ego. And as you can see here, it's kind of tipping out. And the reason why I've tipped it out is because when you're engaging in Facebook, you are outward facing, right? You're in this environment. You're really engaged with what's going on outside of yourself. You tend to be less reflective. You tend to be very concerned about how you're showing up. And the consequence of this is that your ego tips out rather than in, and it kind of inflates, right? It gets concerned about how it is perceived and how it is perceiving others. So Facebook, in a way, is an exemplar of the tipped out ego-facing social network. If we look at some of Jung's thoughts, he called this outward tipping part of the ego the persona, which he described as a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression on others, and on others, on the other hand, to conceal the true nature of the individual. Importantly, Jung did not think that the persona was bad. Like I said before, if you're at a dinner party or a nightclub, your persona is going to be different and appropriately attuned to its surroundings. However, it can become pathological if, Jung says, one identifies with their persona, one no longer knows himself, right? So if you believe that the whole you is that outward tipping part of the ego, you lose access to the rest of you. Donald Winnicott, another psychoanalyst, had a similar idea. I compare these two quite a lot in the book. He talks about the false self, which is also another word for this outward tipping part of the ego. So he says this false self is set up to protect the true self. It responds to challenges in the environment. The false self essentially takes up the role of social compliance, right? So how do I be a good person out there in the world is the job of the false self. Some of us are better at this than others. And actually, in many people, false self could be quite subversive and actually not taking up the role of social compliance for a whole variety of other reasons that we can't get into today. But similarly, Winnicott agrees with Jung, like false self is fine. We need it. We can't walk around being fully ourselves all the time in all of our different environments. That would be unsafe. So yes, we need a false self, but we can't identify with that false self as being the whole thing. And he puts it this way. There are those who can be themselves and also can act, while there are others who can only act and who are completely at a loss when not in a role and when not being appreciated or applauded. So when you become the whole of that outward tipping ego, you become identified with the false self, and then it becomes very dangerous. And then we have situations where, particularly with young people, might be being suicidal after a bad engagement on Instagram, for example, because they have identified that whole false self-impression as being themselves. They didn't get the recognition they needed, and everything collapses. So that's the far end where it can get quite dangerous. And of course, this is the idea of the selfie, which was Oxford Dictionary's word of the year, I think in 2016 or something, kind of the exemplar of an outward-facing ego that wants to show itself out in the world, but also for some kind of public response, right? It really wants the world to see it. It's not a selfie unless it's posted outward. So it's a really good way of thinking about that outward tipping part. False self, this is another conversation. It's not really the best term because it actually isn't false. It's just a representation of the self for a purpose, which is created creatively. So a selfie isn't someone different from who you are. It's a representation of a part of who you are. So I've been talking a lot about ego, so we want to just understand it a little bit better. Egos are part of our identity. There are stories, there are past, there are community identifications, political parties, that kind of thing. They're how we show up in the world, so how we want people to see us and how we think we're seen. But it's not one single thing. We have conflicting urges. We have conflicting desires. We want to be nice, but sometimes we're angry. That's the conflict model of the psyche. And the content of how we show up line is based on a complex process that are all of these elements that are competing through ego on the hand of Facebook, but other psychic agencies and other. And as I said before, when we're online, this is an intrapsychic process and it's an interpersonal process, but very importantly, mediated by the architecture of the online environment. So you take something like LinkedIn, it does something different. It appeals somewhat to the ego, but it really appeals a lot more to the superego, because this is the professional self, superego being kind of like your conscience or how you judge yourself. And the reason why LinkedIn tends to be one of the more boring social networks is because it doesn't have much id in it. It doesn't have much desire. It's kind of, how you dress up for a nice dinner and behave well. For those of you who are familiar with Silk Road, which is closed now, or the dark web, this is where you go online, not through Google, but through other means where you're completely anonymous, and you can buy anything from drugs to guns to putting hits out on people. Silk Road kind of bypasses ego and often superego and goes directly to the id, that part of yourself that is unregulated by conscience, that really goes for it. So there are parts of the non-dark web that appeal to this as well. So you imagine pornography sites, but also, Deliveroo, depending on your mood, can also appeal to those desires inside, where your ego lets go and you're ordering a big fat cake or a double bacon cheeseburger in the middle of the night because you're hungry. Now, another model, we think about how our unconscious drives, to which we are very close, feed a lot of information into the self, right? And the self reaches out to use technology as a tool to engage with others. And if you just look at this kind of little cable here that I'm showing you, it's the thickest in relation to the self, but it starts to narrow. So we are closest to our unconscious drives as an individual, even though there's a lot about ourselves we don't know. That's narrowed down as we decide what we want through technology, and that's narrowed down again when we're reaching out to others. Yeah, so if I'm reaching out to others on Facebook, I'm not face-to-face, so the complexity is greatly reduced. Social media lowers the bar to access to relationships and everything else online, and this is very, very important. It makes almost everything easier. If you want to find out about someone, you can Google them. If you want food, you can order it. If you want something from Amazon, you can get it the next day. It lowers the bar to access, which means our desiring parts of our unconscious can get its needs met quicker, just like the burger instead of the deer. And we also have an issue of scale. So I kind of call this the Tinderization of everything. When we're close to our unconscious drives and we use tech to have our needs met with others, once we have so many others, they start to kind of turn into objects. And if anybody is familiar with Dunbar's number, this is about 150 other people. We are able to maintain an idea of relationship with about 150 people. More than that, our brain simply can't hold information about them anymore. They kind of become more objectified. And when you look at sort of the unlimited nature of right swiping or left swiping on something like Tinder, you can see how it easily objectifies other people because that bar is lowered to access other people. So I'm realizing that I'm kind of coming up on time a bit. So let's move towards our conclusions. So really important, and these are conclusions really for the individual and interpersonal section. We're going to go into the global, political, sociocultural later. Let's remember that selfhood has always been extended into other people's minds, right? So that baby in relation to his mother, or her mother, or his father, or their mother, primary caretaker, right? What the baby wants is the parent to be mindful of them. And what we want in our lives is that the people that we care about to be mindful of us, that they're thinking of us when we're not there. So social media has made that more explicit. So it might be that your loved one is traveling and you're hoping that they're thinking of you. But if they can text you, which is kind of a very basic social media, then that extension is made more explicit. I am thinking of you. The architecture of various social networking sites interface with the unconscious in a variety of different ways. So engagement on SM, by the way, is social media. It's not sadomasochism, although it's kind of funny because in this quote, engagement on sadomasochism is driven by unconscious motivation would be equally true. But it's social media, right? So it's fundamentally relational. It's driven by recognition. And depending on the social media, it may be dominated by outward ego expression. This slide is actually more written for Facebook, I guess, than other things like Twitter or the dark web. So I think I'd want to change that bullet point. So when I wrote my book, I really went in with an open mind and wondered whether social networking really fundamentally changed things, or whether this kind of paradigm shift was really overwrought. I'm now pretty convinced that, yeah, it actually has changed individuals and societies quite a bit for a variety of reasons that I'm going to go into now. So the instantaneous nature of engagement is part of it. And all of these things I'm going to say work synergistically with each other, meaning that you have the one thing and the next thing enhances both of them. So we can share our thoughts with the world instantaneously without thought, right? So if you 25 years ago, if you read a newspaper article you didn't like, you'd have to write a letter to the editor, put it in the post, and it might show up in that newspaper as a letter 2 or 3 days later. So that instantaneousness is kind of new. We can also do this in relation to actual people like celebrities and politicians on Twitter. The ease of replicability, right? So we instantaneously put that thing out there, and then it can be shared, reposted, copied, sent around the world super, super easily. So something that you may have intended for one person can suddenly be available to everyone, which makes our privacy vulnerable. We put it out there, it's replicated, more people know about it than we had expected, and it's instantaneous. Scalability, right? Something that we might share with an individual can suddenly be scaled to pretty much anyone in the world with an internet connection. So the impact of that can be pretty huge. And the online disinhibition effect. So this is the idea that what we tend to put online, we tend to do easier than if we weren't online. So we might say something in a tweet or say something in a message that we would be reluctant to say face to face. So you can imagine how if you're disinhibited and it's instantaneous and it's replicable and it could be a threat to your privacy and it's scalable, how quickly things can get out of hand. Now, most of us are kind of getting pretty used to this these days, but this is kind of an easy way to understand how that all works. So, in addition to all of these problematics, and I guess I also want to share, I'm not dystopian about social media, but these are the dangers of it. Once it's out there and replicated and scaled up, it's very difficult to delete it. So we have this thing called the digital dossier or the cyber shadow that could follow us if it's related to us. Something that we posted online many, many years ago can be found, which affects how other people perceive us. The low bar, which I mentioned before, all of this makes it easier. The low bar is very related to the disinhibition effect. And the aperture effect on complexity, which isn't something I spoke about too much here, but it's that idea that interpersonal recognition, face-to-face internet recognition is a high level of complexity that includes all of your senses: voice, body language, eye contact, smell, unconscious communication. That's wide aperture, just like in a camera. Becomes narrow aperture when we go online. So a text message would be very low complexity, very small aperture, whereas a Skype conversation would be slightly wider, but not as wide as a face-to-face communication. The potential for objectification in the Tinderization of everyday life. And really importantly for our discussions today, the platform's architectural effect on the psyche, right? So really, Facebook is different from Instagram, it's different from Twitter, it's different from LinkedIn, it's different from the Guardian comments page. And we have to be very precise when we're thinking about psychology about how each of these things affect different aspects of the psyche, and then what the cumulative effect is on individuals and cultures. So I bring us back to the original question, what's the last book you read? Let's not think about this here as the last book you read. Let's think about this as anything that you've posted online, right? So you're not sharing the last book you read. You are sharing more like these kinds of questions. Who are you right here, right now, in front of all these people? How do you want to see yourself? How do you want others to see you? What part of you are you raising up and what part of you are you keeping hidden? Where is your private self and where is your public self? And these are just a few questions that I am proposing underlie unconsciously and a little bit consciously almost every time we post something on any social media network. You are doing psychological work with regard to recognition. how you wish to be recognized, how you are recognized, how you recognize other people. And there are some really important consequences to that. So this pretty much draws an end to the individual part of the presentation. I think we're going to probably go into a break about now. And then we're going to move into the collective consequences of these models. So this part is a little bit less psychoanalytic, but I thought it was really important to incorporate other sort of psychological perspectives, particularly when we come to the collective. Psychoanalytic is really good at looking at the individual. It has a lot to say about the collective as well, but other forms of psychology have a lot to add. So I'm going to be talking about this. We're going to be getting a little bit more political and cultural here. And I'm going to start with this one, I'm afraid, which I'm sure we're all sick of hearing about, but we're moving up to another big phase. And I want us to think about 2016. I want us to think about Cambridge Analytica, and think about social media's role in all of that just for a little while, right? So these were the polls leading up to the big Brexit reveal. And if any of you are anyone like me, you will have had a very similar experience, that having seen the polls and having been in filter bubbles, full disclosure, I'm quite a strong Remainer. I didn't think Brexit was going to happen. And I was utterly shocked when it did, because all of the information that I was receiving from what we now understand as being filter bubbles confirmed my hypothesis that it wasn't going to happen. And yet it did happen. And of course, it was global news, as we stunned the world for leaving the EU. People who were on the leave side had similar impressions, right? That people were pretty sure that Brexit was going to happen, again, because of filter bubbles, but also because of the nature in which our society is really becoming more and more polarized, that even the polling organizations were not having full access to the real multiplicity of opinions and political persuasions that people were having. Now, when it came down to it, I think Brexit was down to about 600,000 people who voted for it, right? So this is about 1% of the population. Now, anybody who's interested in all of the machinations that happened around this and Cambridge Analytica, because I can't go into great detail in the time that we have, I would really encourage you to look at Carol Cadwallader's look in The Guardian and The Observer, who's been the investigative reporter who's gone into all of it in great detail. And it's really fascinating, quite frightening read. But she says it's not a stretch to believe that a member of the global 1% found a way to influence this crucial 1% of British voters. Now, I'm not going to get into the nature of who and how, though it is really important, and that there are some nefarious forces at work in it. I want you to think about this idea about not necessarily the 1% influencers, but the 1% influenced, right? So the idea that we're often stuck with is, is social media really going to change my mind? If I'm a pro-Remain, am I really going to be turned to pro-Brexit, even with loads and loads of fake news and filter bubbles and all this kind of stuff? The thing is, probably not, but you don't have to be convinced. Only just enough people have to be convinced on any given notion in order to flip some very important conclusions. It is possible that more than 0.6% of voter growth turnout between 2006 and 2010 might have been caused by a single message on Facebook. So this is another piece of work that was a Get Out the Vote campaign that happened via Facebook. This was a politically neutral campaign, so they weren't saying vote left or right, they were saying vote. But there's some evidence to say that more than 0.5% of the voter growth that in turnout that year could have been as a result of this campaign on Facebook. And when we think about 0.6% of the population, okay, that's slightly lower than the 1% that turned the Brexit vote, but we want to ask these questions about who's getting out the vote, how they're getting out the vote, and then how that might have a profound effect on what's happening in society. Now, we're all a little bit too familiar with this guy. And importantly, in 2016, before the Trump election, he literally said this, right? Soon you'll be calling me Mr. Brexit. I don't think anybody called him Mr. Brexit, but what is he doing here? I think in a way claiming some responsibility for what happened in Brexit. And many, many people believe these days that that Brexit, in a sense, was a trial run for the Trump campaign. And we know through Carol Cadwalader's work that a lot of the same organizations and a lot of the same funding came from the same sources behind the Trump campaign and the Brexit campaign. And it's kind of ironic because when we think back to Obama's first campaign, there was this real sense that they were the first campaign to really use social media as a way to bring out the vote. And for those of us who were left of center, thought this was quite a good thing. But the way in which that campaign used social media, and every campaign was using social media, was in a sense more innocent back in those days. This was like about engaging people and about accessing people rather than about kind of manipulating people, which is now turned into. And we have real reason to be a little bit nervous about what's coming up in November too, because social media again is a war ground. And again, I also want to say this is not necessarily about nefarious actors. We'll get into this a little bit more. So there might be some manipulation from foreign entities or big money, but there's also a lot of issues with the basic algorithms, right? So you don't need nefarious actors to have consequential effects on what people are seeing and the kind of decisions that they're making when they're getting their news from social media. So we move on to that election, and this was like the night. Well, let's see, this is October 31st, right? So election day in the US is November 3rd. So we're talking 3 days before. Our presidential forecast from the New York Times, highly respected outfit, 90% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win. For those of you who were up that night, the New York Times election app had her at more than 90% on election night, and Donald Trump on less than 10% that night. And we all know what happened. We know what happened, but do we know what happened? Why were we all taken by such surprise? There's a lot of reasons for this. Again, just so you can kind of put it in perspective, this is not over a great period of time. This is just over election night, right? So these are various polling organizations measuring the chance of a presidential win of Clinton or Trump that just swapped when the numbers came in. So the reality principle hit very hard and very quickly. And for the entire time up until, let's say, 9:20, it looked like it was going one way and one way only. So what happened? The Trump campaign had quite a lot of information from Cambridge Analytica, a lot of it 5,000 data points on 220 million Americans with personality profiles on all of them. I'll talk to you a little bit about how that works. Now, 5,000 data points sounds like a lot. Some of them are more important than others. One might be an IP address. It might be what browser you're using, what computer you're using, stuff that may not be too helpful. But some of those data points could be more interesting, such as, how neurotic you are, whether you're a worrier or not, whether you're left wing or right wing, whether you're gay or straight, whether you're black or white, some pretty personally identifying information. The Republicans also had something called the voter vault, which was another source of online information, which contained 300 terabytes of data with more than 7 billion micro-targeting data points on more than 200 million voters. Now, these are just really big numbers. And if you don't know what a terabyte is, let's just say that 300 of them is a hell of a lot of information and a lot of data points. This is really the nature of big data that we sort of voluntarily and involuntarily wake up so much information about ourselves online that it can be quite disturbing. So what's going on? Now, we're going to be looking at the psychological part of this mostly. And for those of you who might be familiar with psychometrics, again, this is not a very psychoanalytic approach, but it is psychological personality profiling, which is based on what is often called five-factor analysis, right? So five-factor being the main personality types that have broadly been concluded over the years in academic and experimental psychology to be relatively representative of how people are. And the easy to remember acronym for this is OCEAN, and it stands for openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, each of these function on a scale. So you can scale highly for openness, in which case, you're likely to, let's say, be adventurous in the kind of foods that you taste. Maybe you're into bungee jumping, that sort of thing, or low in openness, in which case you wouldn't be open to new ideas. You would be quite conservative in your own ideas and have very low impact by other persuasions. So I'm going to go through each of these, but it's just important to know that they operate on a spectrum, that there are relatively well-respected scales that can measure you as a personality in each of these areas. As someone like me who's a little bit more psychoanalytically inclined, I have some reservations and some criticisms of this model, but it is a useful model and it does have its own verity that's important to bear in mind here. So I was just talking about openness. Openness generally means how open you are essentially as a personality to new experiences, how curious you are, how creative you are. It involves sensation-seeking, risk-taking, and unconventionality. So if you score high on openness, you're more on the Salvador Dali side of things. If you score low on openness, you're going to be less interested in new experiences. You're going to be more of a safety seeker rather than a sensation seeker. And you're going to be pretty dyed in the wool in your ideas. It's going to be very hard to change your mind about things. Conscientiousness has to do with how disciplined you are. So you're highly disciplined if you score highly on conscientiousness, preferring structure to spontaneity. So it is possible, for example, to score high on conscientiousness and high on openness. So they are mutually exclusive, but you can imagine where those overlaps kind of happen. Some people would imagine that a highly conscientious person wouldn't be a risk taker, but imagine a free rock climber, for example, who would be sensation seeking on the one hand, but highly conscientious in making that path up the side of the wall. You would have to be, or you'd be putting yourself quite at risk. Then we also have extraversion. So obviously in psychoanalysis, that's the opposite of introversion. But in this model, it's just extraversion on a scale, right? So high extraversion or low extraversion. So if you're high, you're more the Lady Gaga end of things, sociable, outwardly focused, like to be out there in public, or energized by being out in the world. If you're low on extraversion, you tend to be more of a loner, tend to like smaller groups of people and that sort of thing. Agreeableness, just another word for being nice. People do scale high and low on agreeableness. So if you're scoring highly, you tend to be compassionate, warm, friendly, and nice. If you score low, you're more the prickly type, a little bit colder, not immediately warm. Doesn't mean that you won't be with a little bit of warming up, but as a general personality constellation, that's how it operates on agreeableness. Neuroticism is about worry. So if you score high on neuroticism, you easily experience unpleasant emotions. You tend to be a worrier. You tend to be highly emotional, to be worrying about things more so than people who are low on neuroticism, who kind of just more stoic in life. So how do you use these psychometrics? So the way psychologists use them is they give you a measure which might have 500 questions on it, asking you all sorts of things about, in a party, do you feel like this? Is your desk messy or clean? They're usually yes or no questions that after 100, 150, 250, depending on how many they are, you can get a pretty accurate read on where people measure on all of these 5 things at this point in their life. Now, when we think about how these operated online, we have an instance where you take that ubiquitous online personality quiz, right? So, which it could be something as innocent as, which member of Friends are you, right? Or which Star Wars character would you be? And you take a test that's maybe 5 questions or 10 questions that are basically built upon the theory of the 5-factor analysis. So what happened early in Facebook, and this is done now, is that actually this 5-factor analysis quiz was done. It was promoted across Facebook. People filled it out, shared it with their friends, and basically for free gave Facebook and the progenitors of this test their 5-factor analysis. Not necessarily with the accuracy of a psychological assessment, but it turned out to be pretty close. This information was basically scraped off of Facebook. Now they've made it so you can't do this anymore. So this was sort of a window in time. However, the horse has bolted the barn, and it's pretty easy to create a 5-factor analysis of who we are simply based on the information that we put on Facebook. Now imagine that you took this test, you shared it with your friends, they shared it, and then somebody really smart at Cambridge Analytica or somewhere else correlated those results to the things that you like, share, post, and any other user demographics on Facebook. So you wouldn't necessarily have to take the test anymore. It just turns out that people who would score high in extraversion also tended to like Lady Gaga's Facebook page, for example, and that there was a high correlation between each of these things. So you can start using everyday regular behavior on Facebook to correlate personality analysis based on the 5 factors. And then if you really wanted to get smarter about it, you would use that 5-factor analysis as your audience to influence people. So if you wanted to reach out to high extraversion, high openness people, you would target your stories to people who followed Lady Gaga's page, for example. Now, obviously not just her page, but all of those other pages and groups that were correlated to high levels of extraversion. Then imagine that you take something like the neuroticism, people who are scoring high in neuroticism. So you would imagine people who are Googling illnesses all the time, that kind of thing, or looking at similar groups on Facebook and targeting worrying news at people who are already worrying. And you can imagine where we can go with this. So in the old days, for example, if you were in the gun lobby in America, you would be putting out television ads about why people should support NRA supporting candidates, right? Such is the sophistication now, and actually you can see this on a YouTube video if you Google it by Alexander Nix, who was the director of Cambridge Analytica. We have 2 completely different gun supporting ads going out to people who had different 5-factor analyses. So for someone who tests as highly neurotic and conscientious, to appeal to their sense of threat is the way in. So there were a series of ads that were promoted that were encouraging people to vote for candidates that protected the right to bear arms, so that by showing them the increase in crime rates, or as we know now, the perceived increase in crime rates, people would feel unsafe enough to feel that they needed a gun in their home and support someone who would do that. Now, you go to a different part of the country, you go to someone who isn't particularly neurotic and isn't actually worried so much about crime. Think about the great Western states like Wyoming, for example, where many of the people there have guns for hunting. For these people who showed low openness, but high on agreeableness, they wanted to appeal to their sense of tradition, habits, and family. So the gun ads in places like, they weren't even in places, they're to people, would show a picture of a father and son with a shotgun, for example, going out to the great outdoors to go deer hunting and saying, do you want the Democrats to take away your right to the great American tradition of hunting and doing this with your family? So 2 completely psychologically aimed perspectives, to get to the same end. So the sophistication of this is really, really something else. So we want to ask the question here, how accurate is this? Do they really know? Do they really know you? And when it comes to big data, the answer is kind of yes and no. Okay. So some research has shown that when you go onto Facebook, 68, as little as say under 70, then 70 likes that you've had on Facebook can predict your skin color with 95% accuracy, can predict your sexual orientation with 85% accuracy, and your party affiliation with 85% accuracy. And it is said, I think a little bit hyperbolically in this Motherboard article from 2017, 70 likes, Facebook can know as much as what your friends know about you. 150 likes, they can know what your parents know about you. And 300 likes, what your partner knows about you. And even more hyperbolically, more likes could even surpass what a person thought they knew about themselves. Now, I think this is just a little bit much. First of all, we know an awful lot about ourselves that we are not sharing because of this whole nature of what I was talking about in the first part, that you are making choices about what you share online for the most part because of how you wish to present yourself. And particularly when you're looking at Facebook, you are presenting a particular image, right? So the parts of you that you're not sharing, you may know about yourself and making choices not to share, Facebook isn't going to know about you. A little bit more complex when you think about your entire usage on technology. So I would imagine that Google may know a lot more about you than Facebook, primarily because they know everything that you're doing on Facebook. And they also know those things that you're searching for that you're not sharing, which might be a little bit more revealing than what you are sharing. So I'm just going to check my watch here so I know how much time I've got left. Okay, we're still good. Okay, so it's not like pulling a rabbit out of the hat. It's not a magic trick, right? So this is really important. It's like, oh my gosh, somebody can know my skin color within, less than 70 likes. Somebody can know your skin color by looking at you as well. So while it seems like magic, it's not so much magic. When you think about the things that you give away when you go online with regard to your politics, your sexuality, your race, your cultural background, we do tend to give it away, right? It's not magic stuff. There is some of the, you do start to move into the magic when you correlate more and more and more of that information. And that's where those gun ads start to get a little bit scary. So we tend to have this feeling about going online that creeps us out a little bit. And here we move back into psychoanalysis a little bit to think about why it works, but also why it's kind of creepy. So basically, the machinations that are going on in the background are these, right? Ourselves are categorized through these, well, originally by how these tests were taken, but now pretty much just our basic behavior on social networks. Our algorithms, the algorithms within the network, identify the desired demographics. So when you're choosing an audience to advertise to on Facebook, by choosing audiences like this, and again, we can use the example of the Lady Gaga page for Extraversion, you can find people who are relatively extroverted to advertise to, which is a level of sophistication well beyond what we had a very, very few years ago. And then what happens is fake and real news panders to those personalities. Now, this is really important, right? So I'm talking about algorithms here alone. So before you have, say, a nefarious force who wants to submit fake news into your feed and is choosing to do that, the algorithms are already kind of doing that on their own. Not because they were designed to be evil, but because their job is to produce like for like. So if you are liking lots of pages that are indicative of your fear of the world, you are more and more likely to see news stories, real or fake, about how scary the world is. So this is before anybody gets involved, right? Really, really important to consider. Okay, this is why we have our filter bubbles widening and widening. These algorithms are doing it on their own. They are not about presenting new information to us. They are about enhancing our confirmation bias. And then minds are changed, or that's the idea. Our minds changed. Let's ask ourselves that question. You'll be familiar with this model here, right? So now we're thinking about technology in that interpersonal level and that intercultural level. And we're thinking really between the distinction between influence and manipulation. Okay. We influence each other as human beings. The algorithms influence us through that relationship to our confirmation bias as well. And there's another level that comes in, which is manipulation. So if those news stories and if that content is made to appeal to our personality structures based on these conclusions made on the 5-factor analysis, it starts to turn into manipulation. But it does provoke that question again, doesn't it? Like, are they going to change my mind? Yeah, you think about what's important to you in life. You know, if you're center left, center right, left or right, how you feel about abortion, how you feel about Brexit, you probably feel pretty sure about your feelings, and actually seeing some news to the other side might not change your mind. But big data kind of has a slightly different story depending on who we're trying to appeal to. So this is where the good news is. So just go back here. The reason why I put this unconscious bubble here is big data is about big numbers. So this is about how we understand vast numbers of people based on important but relatively simplistic ideas about how people are, whether they're open, whether they're nice, whether they're right. Unconscious is much more complex than that. So even if you have a relatively good idea of your 5-factor analysis, who you are is much bigger. And big data is really interested in the nomothetic, not the graphic. And quite simply, that means it's interested in big numbers of huge amounts of people, not you as an individual, at least not yet. You might get there, it always be fast, and artificial intelligence is a whole other thing that I'm into. But at the moment, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people and the assumptions that we can make about a small percentage of those people who are influenceable on some of these levels. So big data is also all about the what and not about the why. So do you know who I am? No. Can some assumptions about me? And then this last bullet, I can't even read, my screen thing is in the way. Okay. Oh, now I've really got myself into trouble. Okay. I'm excited for why. This is why I really want to draw this distinction between the big numbers and the small numbers. And yes, we should be concerned about what is known about us, but you can work with a psychoanalyst 4 days a week on the couch over 10 years, and you're still going to be discovering more. So I guess it's one level of reassurance that we're not at the stage of where Big Brother is inside your head, but we should be nervous and we should be on top of how things develop here. So again, saying that was 2016. We think about the Obama period, the innocence of social media at that stage. Are we going to be looking back at 2016 and thinking that that's an innocent period? I mean, a lot can happen in 4 years. What's going to happen this November is anybody's guess at this stage, but we do have some new things happening which are very concerning, which I want to share with you. So many of you will have probably heard about deep fake videos. Deep fake videos double in 9 months. Here's another one. Facebook tries to curb deep fake videos as 2020 election heats up. You thought fake news was bad. Deep fakes are where real truth goes to die. So at the moment, in 2016, if you had some level of critical thinking, and a lot of people don't, which is part of the problem, you could see where a news source was coming from and maybe make some kind of decision, right, about whether you trust that news source or not. The worry is that a lot of people don't have that capacity and we're trusting bad news sources. What happens when those news sources, you can't trust them anymore and you really don't know the nature of the news that you're getting? Are we, I showed you that first picture of Zuckerberg at Congress. Can we trust, can we trust a government to stop this? And can we trust our governments to stop these sorts of things when there might be an interest in that? And I think this is kind of worrying. So I need to come out of my share for a second here and share something else with you. I'm going to share a little video with you here. Okay. I got to go back to my thing here. So this was a deep fake of Obama, right? Now, because of the nature of these deep fakes at the moment, you could probably have just about worked out, couldn't you, that it wasn't quite right, and it kind of beggared belief. But these things move very, very quickly, and as far as we're aware, they might change sooner rather than later. Ultimately, deep fakes are simply amplifying what I call the liar's dividend, says Danielle Citron. When nothing is true, then the dishonest person will thrive by saying what's true is fake. So this is a really important quote that I'm including because it's not really just the nature of whether you can sell the fake news, as it were, through deep fakes. It's the fundamental assault on truth that is the issue. So everybody starts doubting the sources when the sources in live video feed, for example, can be mistrusted. What adds to this, particularly from the psychoanalytic perspective, is Freud's idea of the uncanny, where the uncanny is this kind of almost like home, but slightly not home, right? It's kind of a paradox. So the nature of what makes deepfake so uncanny to us now is that the technology is a tiny bit short of being perfect. So it thrusts us into what we call this uncanny valley, right? So that you look at that face and it's like almost like you expect that face to be, but it's also slightly different. This is where horror films kind of really live, at that slightly askew moment that can't possibly be right. How deepfake develops over the next short years and how much we are thrust as a society into uncanny valley is anybody's guess. Here's another kind of, I need to come out again, another kind of not beautifully done deep fake, but kind of amusing at the same time. Again, you can see we can tell that these are deep fakes because of the slightly not perfect rendering. But let's see what happened between, again, 2008, 2016, 2016, 2020. We really are, and this is where I do tend to get a little bit pessimistic, we really are on the precipice of some potentially scary stuff. And the more that we learn, I think, from a psychological perspective, from the inside, from the idiographic rather than the nomothetic, meaning the individual's perspective rather than the big numbers, the better we're going to be. Now, what happened in 2016 is a little bit easier to understand from the perspective of the United States, is that that 1% of the population only needed to be affected in order for change to happen. So this was, in a sense, kind of an accident of the messed upness of the American electoral system with the Electoral College. So because all of the electoral votes from a given state go to the winner, those three states in the Rust Belt, what was it, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, maybe one other, you didn't need to change a whole lot of minds. Some of those states were won by less than 10,000 votes, which is actually less than 1%. Okay. So if you can accurately and smartly target a political system and use social media influence and manipulation to change the minds of just a few people, you can affect serious consequences, right? So people tend to think you need to change lots of minds. You don't need to change lots of minds. Okay, I'm going to leave you with one more amusing video. This is one of our friend Mark Zuckerberg.
I wish I could keep telling you that our mission in life is connecting people, but it isn't. We just want to predict your future behaviors. Spectre showed me how to manipulate you into sharing intimate data about yourself and all those you love for free. The more you express yourself, the more we own you.
Okay, a little bit creepy because obviously that was a deep fake too, but that one was pretty accurate. So we are moving to some serious accuracy when we come to these situations. So let me just bring us to an end, and then we can move right into Q&A. Here we are. So do we need to be reconsidering what we do on Facebook? It's a little bit too late, right? Again, the horse has left the barn. We need to be concentrating on critically understanding fundamentals and moving towards some kind of regulation based on a more general psychological understanding of how these networks affect us. And at the moment, I think that there's not enough work being done, particularly on that qualitative process bit that we were talking at the beginning. Really important stuff with the big numbers, but what's going on interpersonally? This one we saw. And that's what I'm going to end on. Maybe a little bit depressing. So maybe I'll just say one more thing before I stop. There is a potential enabling, which I probably didn't talk enough about today, that social media can offer and that technology can offer, a potential to reach out to different kinds of people, to seek support where support doesn't exist. You imagine at the moment there are people living in all sorts of countries that don't have access to information, that can access information that can really help them. To quote Kranzberg, he said, technology is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. I think that's really important. Technology isn't neutral. The algorithms are not neutral, but it doesn't mean it's a bad thing either. We just have to be very thoughtful and very critical about the next steps that we take as individuals and as a society. And I think what I'm going to do is stop my share screen there. Have I done that? Bring Niall back and we can move into the Q&A.
That was really, really interesting. So we've got a few questions here from some of the participants. So the first one is from Olivia. She's asked, can you say anything about how neurodiversity shows up? For example, might autistic people benefit socially or relationally through certain platforms for social networking than face-to-face or not?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And this is actually one of those examples about where great potential is offered by social media. My particular interest in this is in relation to psychotherapy and neurodiversity. So for example, while one of the great losses across the board is when people trade high complexity interpersonal interaction for Facebook, that's where you get the loss of recognition. For people who experience themselves in some way on the autistic spectrum, neurodiverse, that level of interpersonal complexity is actually inhibiting and very, very difficult, right? So it would be more difficult for some of those people to engage in a therapeutic session face-to-face in a room. It's just too much, right? So one way to handle that is to move on to video conferencing, which is one level of remove. Another level is to move on to text communication, even, where the release, the less complexity enables greater engagement. And it's the same way socially, right? Again, all these things have to be kind of measured, but it's sort of like someone who finds that interpersonal complexity difficult might be able to join an online forum where there's greater potential for social connection without the fear of that complexity. And a lot of this actually happens in gaming environments. So you have like big social environments, in online gaming where people feel much more comfortable engaging than others. The catch, which I'll just throw in there, is complex interpersonal engagement is still really important. And what you want to try and do is develop towards more of that if you can, because it can also have a collusive effect where you stay in that safe world and you stop taking those interpersonal chances outside, which isn't just a neurodiverse thing. It's happening right across society in relation to dating and dating apps, right? So people are having low-level interpersonal connection, whether they're on Tinder or Grindr or whatever, and then actually after the second or third date, if you get that far, the interpersonal complexity of actually meeting someone in real life and not just through an app becomes challenging. Yeah, so we need to develop that skill.
For sure. Okay, so the next one's from Julie Dixon, and Julie says that she works with the young adults who often get into a pickle with what they post in social media. Can you recommend any resources that she can use in her work?
Well, I guess I'd probably recommend my own book, Keep Your Cool. I wouldn't recommend Psychodynamics of Social Networking, but there is a section in there about how to manage your social media. I think as someone who's working with young people, there's kind of two sort of, I don't know if it's two, there's some general rules that I would sort of recommend. And the first one is I always say, always curiosity first, right? So there's always this kind of will to either want to do something, fix something, stop something, tell them to stop something, right? To like stop this craziness that's happening. And it's like, okay, first be curious, wonder what's going on, wonder why it's going on with that person, why that person is making those choices. And so you can kind of fill in that recognition piece. Someone's going onto the social media seeking something, they're getting something different, which is damaging. So let's find out the whole picture before we say, we'll just come out of the WhatsApp group, whatever it is. Mm. And the second thing for adults and young people is always work towards an active relationship with your technology rather than a passive one. Mm. So most people will have their notification settings at passive, meaning however it's set up. You get your notification, you when your emails come, the notifications come. Your feeds are coming in passively. We need to help each other make wise decisions about how we use the social media and how we set the notifications and settings so that we are more and more in charge of what happens rather than enabling it to be in charge of us, which is the short answer to probably a whole day's workshop.
Brilliant. I love that. I think that has the potential to improve a lot of like interpersonal relationships, a lot of conflict. Just that one rule, to have curiosity first. That's so powerful, you know?
Yeah, we tend to get quite defensive and anxious, don't we? So we just want to like take it away. You know, we forget that you're drawn there for a reason. So let's find out why.
Big time. Okay, so next one. If you were advising Mark Zuckerberg on how to optimize Facebook for mental health and well-being, is there anything that you would tell him? Any advice you would give him?
Probably a lot, but I'll tell you, I had an interesting conversation. I was actually involved in a consultation with Facebook around their hate speech and violence kind of protocols, right? So what they allow and what they don't allow, and when they should ban people from talking, when they shouldn't. And in the conversation with the guy who's doing the consultation, he said something like, I forget exactly what word he used. I wish I could think of it, but he said the reason why we allow so much of that is because we want to encourage. I forget. I really wish, but it was something we wish to encourage cross communication or something. So somebody says this person should be killed. This is like a violent speech or hate speech. And they want to give the opportunity for someone to say why they shouldn't be killed. This was kind of the justification. And the reason why I wish I could remember the exact words is that those words that he chose indicated a very content-based understanding of what goes on Facebook. So yes, you have the opportunity to produce content of a contrary point of view. No, they shouldn't be killed. But it doesn't actually engage process. All it does is it increases a polarized, angry back and forth situation. Right?
Okay.
So they had a total misunderstanding that by somebody having the opportunity to state an opposite point of view is an engaged dialogue around that point of view rather than just a tennis match between people. And he said, I never really thought of that. Like, I never really thought that there was a difference between engagement and playing tennis with words. And I said, the more that Facebook can use its platform to enhance engagement, the better. And the opportunity to say one thing or the other is not engagement. So that's one thing I would say, is find out ways to increase engagement. And the other thing is like, work out your bloody algorithms, right? Like, you need to create algorithms that include diversity of view and background and culture in feeds, or we're in big, big trouble. So rather than duplicating confirmation bias, something like, it's like I call it the French radio thing. In France, some like 40% of the music they play on French radio has to be French music, right? They don't want just all English music in France. So it's like some percentage ought to include diverse views. alongside the capacity to engage with them, rather than shunting us more and more into filter bubbles.
Big time. And I suppose leading on from that, a good question to ask would be, on an individual level, how can we monitor our own confirmation bias and ensure that we're not just going further and further down our own kind of rabbit holes? And do you have any habits that you do to keep yourself objective about the information that you're consuming?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of it is toxic. There's a friend of mine in the States who says that he makes himself watch 20 minutes of Fox News every night to have the experience of what actually most people are consuming. And I find some of the discourse on some of those networks so toxic that I find it difficult to watch. But I find it's about, you have to find a way to engage with people, right? So it may not necessarily be the way you're consuming news. And I'll give you an example that's very fresh from me from last night. I try not to engage in Twitter in the ways that I'm advising now, but last night I did, and I posted something that was a little bit angry and a little bit mean about what's going on in the Supreme Court nominations in the States. And some guy tweeted me back and said, basically, that wasn't very nice, and I don't think you're being particularly objective, and something else. And I was a little bit pissed off that he tweeted that. And then I kind of looked at my tweet and I just decided, like, this is it's a non-productive tweet. And actually you can look at my Twitter and see the deleted tweet, maybe the conversation I had with him afterwards. But I deleted the tweet and then responded to him and said, I don't really agree that anybody can be objective, which is what he was asking for. But I don't think that my tweet was productive, so I took it down. And then he sent me a direct message later saying, I really appreciate you taking it down, and this is what I think. And then I sent him a direct message back and I said, I don't agree with your point of view, but I would always prefer dialogue over being nasty. And then we had a talk in the direct message bit, which is brand new, right? So it's kind of like, you're never going to be swayed by watching you're very unlikely to be swayed by watching a YouTube video or reading the Telegraph or the Guardian or whatever it is that doesn't share your views. But if you really speak to a person who holds those views with an open heart and an open mind, and try to endure your own defensiveness, usually with another person in a highly interpersonal complex environment or more complex environment, you can allow yourself to move a little bit further and at least empathize and understand. So the more of that, the better.
For sure. That's great advice. The next question here is from Bia. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Bia. But Bia says, you've discussed social media being a meditating force between various individuals, but there is a sense in which people are increasingly engaged with social media platforms as objects or others in and of themselves, as if algorithms themselves have sentience, for example. So could you maybe speak a bit more about that there, Aaron?
Yeah. So this is the great paradox. Is that, like, when I started this talk, I said I feel like I'm talking to myself here, but I can see that I'm talking to 72 people. So there's two really important things here. One is, yes, that has an objectifying capacity, which does not help where we're trying to go. So we are, in a sense, fundamentally already geared up to objectify across the media. And this thing that I mentioned before about Dunbar's number, the 150, I don't want to go like way too deeply into it, and I know we're nearly out of time, but basically the reason why we have this Dunbar's number is called the social brain hypothesis, which is the idea that we developed human brains so that we could maintain and understand levels of trust between individuals in hunter-gatherer tribes, right? So somebody gives you some food one winter, you give them food the next winter because there's a reciprocity there. Somebody stiffs you one winter, you don't trust them the next winter, right? That's what it's about. And what's interesting is on Facebook, they found that even if somebody has 5,000 friends, maintained relationships, that's people that you're actually posting with, is almost always, it's under 150, it's about 120. So you're still in Dunbar's number, even though you have this. But as soon as you surpass Dunbar's number, you're back into objectification again, because you can't hold in mind more than those amount of people. So these are the two. So we are geared through the architecture of the network to objectify rather than to subjectify. So there are some cures within the network that I talked about before, fixing those algorithms to ensure that we're getting different points of view and to see if there are ways to increase engagement rather than the back and forth. But unless we have the in real life moments to share with other individuals who have diverse views of ours, we're not going to cure it online, because online is part of the problem.
Yeah, so important. Have you got any social media advice for people who would consider themselves introverted?
So, yes, use it as a way in and develop. I mean, it's hard now in COVID times because we're all introverted, and more introverted people, in a sense, had fewer opportunities to practice their extroverted side. But I would say use your social media as a step up towards enhancing the muscle that allows you to challenge your introversion, right? So create enough safety in the relationship to go out there and experiment more with the high complexity interpersonal stuff. And I would say the same thing for those people who are more extroverted, where it's easy to be out there all the time. Challenge your introverted muscle by doing the same thing, by coming off, by doing it less, by spending more time with yourself, because whether you're on one side, introversion or extroversion, you can always practice and strengthen your less developed side. And one side is no better than the other. It's just better to have some strength in both.
I really like that. You mentioned in your talk that there are some limitations with the ocean model. From a psychoanalytic perspective, could you maybe tell us about some of those limitations, please, Aaron?
So, I think, where there's a commonality is this idea that personality, in a lot of ways, is kind of fixed. You kind of are the way you are. Like I've said, the introversion extroversion thing. If you're mostly introverted, you can develop some extroversion. If you're mostly extroverted, you can develop some introversion. But you're not going to become an introvert or an extrovert or the other. So if you view the five model as a personality structure, you also understand that in different contexts, you may operate differently in those spectrums. So it might be that you score relatively low on openness, but like the example I was giving you before, you might be high on agreeableness, and you might have a one-to-one conversation with someone who can enable you to be more open. Right? Because it's contextual. So your agreeableness allows you to be maybe interested in what somebody else has to say. You're going to be nice. You're not going to be super defensive. And that might get into your openness. And the Freud's model, which is basically the conflict model, is that there are parts of us that go one way and there are parts of us that go the other way. And then we're in conflict, and what we produce is a result of that conflict, right? So I hate you and I love you. So I'm going to be like, touch it, sometimes I'm going to be nice and sometimes I'm going to be passive aggressive, right? It's like that both things are operating at the same time. So the criticism is that it's all happening at the same time, that there are parts that are open, there are parts that are less open, they will be in conflict with each other, and they will produce a result. And the more insight we have, we can become aware of the parts of us that are closed down and the parts of us that are more open, and kind of grease up the wheels of that conflict, which enables us to have more flexibility when we're in the world. Yeah, so it's not totally fixed.
Very interesting. And how can someone develop more kind of self-awareness around these areas? Like, would that have to be done through therapy, or have you got any other things that people could do to increase their self-awareness around that?
Yeah, I think therapy is obviously really helpful. I'm a little bit biased, but I think, to take the time every week to sit down and be curious about yourself for the benefit of personal insight, I think it's really good. I think mindfulness meditation is also really helpful, but you kind of have to know how to do it, and that might take some training, because it's not just sitting and breathing, it's that non-judgmental curiosity about what's going on inside of you. And for some people, formal practice of mindfulness is really difficult, but I think you don't necessarily need it. I think the more you become aware of yourself when you're wound up, for example, if you catch yourself being wound up, that's a really good moment to be curious about what wound you up. right? So you step away from that and you be like, okay, why do I feel so tense right now? I'm just going to wonder. And maybe you write about it in your journal. Maybe you talk to a voice memo on your phone. You just take the opportunity to be curiously non-judgmental about it. So the next time you get wound up, you have a little bit more knowledge.
We've one here from Stephen Wright, and Stephen says, do you think algorithms should be tweaked to offer a balanced flow of information? So they offer information that is antithetical to your personality and current worldview. And do you think this could work in combating polarization?
So I think yes, but it's controversial. I think that social media needs to do some social engineering. Okay. When I was a kid, I was in the era of busing. So it was like when they were desegregating schools in the US, right? So they would bus white kids and black kids backwards and forwards so that they were all going to school together. And I think I really benefited from this experience. And that was social engineering. It was just like, if all the white kids in the suburbs are going to school with each other and all the black kids in the city, which is like it was where I grew up, are going to school together, you're never going to get this high complex interpersonal relating, right? So I had that. I had really great multi-ethnic, multicultural upbringing that was designed by the people in power at the time to intentionally make an algorithm, right? So I think yes, but the danger is, but it's the same danger we have now. The danger is you're asking a few people in power to make decisions about how to socially engineer our global community online. In defense of that very scary proposition, I'd say we're socially engineering already, but kind of passively. So those algorithms are pushing us all apart into filter bubbles. So even though that's kind of happening in a kind of automated way, shouldn't we automate it in a way that, yes, does increase our interrelations to people that we would be less familiar with? You know, what would it be like if Republicans had at least 20% of their feed fed by Democrats and vice versa, or Palestinians and Israelis, or, you know, any conflict zone where you just kind of have to have that encounter? Who knows? But it's got to be better than what we've got now.
It's such a good idea. Like almost like before you get to read the news that you want to read, you should have to read the other sides first. You kind of have to earn your confirmation bias that way.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Although I think it's going to be less effective with a news feed than with a person feed, right? So it's like, because people will impact you, whereas news, it's easier to be like, you know.
Definitely. We've got one here from Ruth. Can you give a basic survival advice or a basic survival guide to master today's information climate? It's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, again, I always come back to this active versus passive. So the vast majority of us are passive recipients of what our smartphones throw at us. And we just have to make decisions. So this thing that we were talking about before about finding yourself wound up, people are like, they're like going through their feeds and they're getting wound up and they're not even aware of it, right? So you're like scrolling through, you're getting angry and you're scrolling and scrolling more and it's got you, right? It's got you in its clutches. So it's like, wow, if you became aware that scrolling made you anxious, you might choose to scroll less, right? So I say take control over your tech. Make a decision when you're going to check, right? So if you're going to check your Facebook or your Instagram, don't just do it when you're bored. Decide when you're going to do it and how long you're going to do it. Turn your notifications off so that you're going to look at your notifications rather than them telling you to look. Take my favorite piece of advice, which I've now done for 5 years. I don't have the email app on my phone, so I can't check emails unless I'm sitting in front of a computer, because I realized they were winding me up and there was nothing I could do on my, it took forever to respond to an email on my phone. I'd rather have the keyboard in front of me. So use your insight, work out what's getting you nuts and stop doing it so much, right? And I think that's better than a digital detox. It's great to take a week off, but if you're coming back and engaging in the same behavior, you're in trouble. So decide how you want to engage in stuff. And like your suggestion, read the alternate news, but find the time when you can do that without being too disturbed and for how long. Yeah. Look at your feeds, but decide when you're going to do that. And if you're looking at feeds and it always causes you grief, don't look at those feeds anymore unless you can really determine that it's helpful for you.
Yeah, that's great advice. We've just got a couple more questions here before we finish up. Have you got any documentary recommendations in this area that people could check out?
There's a brand new one on Netflix at the moment called The Social Dilemma, which is really good. So I think it came out 2 weeks ago. I'd say, yeah, definitely watch that. There are probably a few more that I can't think of offhand, but that's a really good.
Cool. And in terms of the optimal use of social media for society, do you know if there's any specific countries that are doing that have practices or recommendations that are working especially well, or is it too universal? Is there any countries you know of that have different policies in place around these things?
Well, I know that there are some countries that ban the use of them, and they're usually totalitarian regimes, and that's more so people can't organize, which I don't think is brilliant. The fundamental issue is, and we see that really problematically everywhere now, is that these are corporations, right? So, Facebook is a corporation based in one country that operates globally. So it's very difficult to regulate modern corporations, and the governments are weak. So I'm not aware of any countries that are, just those ones that sort of ban it. But I think it's going to have to be a global response. Governments have to reform to work out what they need to be doing to influence the corporation.
Okay. Okay. So the last question here from Maya, have you published any academic papers or studies on this, or do you recommend any that we can read in addition to your books?
So there's one quite psychoanalytic paper that I wrote called TMI and the Transference, LOL, which is in I think if you Google it, you'll find it. It's probably behind a paywall, but it's actually a clinical example. So those of you that are clinically interested, although it is pretty much been the second chapter of the book is broadly that paper repurposed. Most of the work that I've done since the publication of the book is more publicly accessible stuff. So articles in the Huffington Post or places or blogs or that sort of thing. I kind of moved out of to academic work. Although a guy called Jakob Johansson, who is based, he's in, I don't know, I think maybe UCL, but I'm not sure. Anyway, yeah, he's based in London. He's an academic, has recently published a book. I can't remember what it's called, but it's also a psychoanalytic perspective on social media, which I'd recommend. I think you might want to get it from your library. I think it's like £90 or something hardback, but there is some good stuff out there.
Awesome. Right. Well, one more actually from Inderjit. She's asked, any thoughts on the Black Mirror / China idea of social ratings based on online activity to give a social rating that can be used in day-to-day interactions? What do you think about that?
Yeah, love Black Mirror. And I know this episode that she's talking about in relation to what they're doing in China with regard to social credit. I think in many ways we're kind of there already, which is kind of disturbing. I don't know what more to say other than that the dystopian perspective that Black Mirror gives us offers us a lot to think about. On the good news side of it, the uncanny feeling that it gives us is an important indicator of the direction that we want to move as human beings and why it's so important to develop critical psychological perspectives on the ways some of these technologies are going to move independently, right? So I think, again, Sherry Turkle, there's another one. Sherry Turkle, she's a psychologist based at MIT, wrote Alone Together and a series of other books about psychology and technology. One of her quotes is, technology may give us what we want, but not necessarily what we need. Mm-hmm. So we really need to go back to that insight and say, what do we, Tinder is a really good example. Deliveroo is a really good example. It satisfies this want, but then we find ourselves needing something more. We get the date, but we don't get the relationship that we're really looking for, if you see what I mean. So we really need to move away from the wants and finding out what we really need is complex psychological, emotional beings in the world.
For sure. Well, I think that's a great point to end on, Aaron. I just want to say thanks again for taking some time to share some of your knowledge and wisdom with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Is there anywhere you'd like to send people online? Is there anything you'd like to share about Stillpoint and the work you're currently doing there before we head off?
Yeah, well, Stillpoint, I wish I were in a position to launch it now, but we're actually going to be launching a social network for the psychologically curious, probably in October. And it will be a place to go share information, get really good content about the stuff I'm talking about today in relation to all sorts of social interesting issues. So go to the Stillpoint Spaces website, join our newsletter, and then we can let you know. It's going to be free for everyone. So that would be great. I'm really dead curious to know myself how that's going to work and whether it's going to work well. Otherwise, you can find Stillpoint or myself on Twitter, Instagram, usual places. I do have a professional Facebook page, but I don't actually use Facebook myself anymore for relatively obvious reasons.
Awesome. And whenever the lockdown ends and people are looking for like a space to work in London, I used to be a member of Stillpoint Spaces in London, and it's just a great community, great place to work. And they've also got like therapy rooms to rent out there as well. So it's a great place and I highly recommend it. So Aaron, thanks a million for taking the time. It's been a pleasure and speaking.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great to see you. And it was great to see you every day back when you used to come to our co-working. So it's really, really nice to see you now. Have a good rest of your day.